Okay.
Great. Thank you. Figure out where I have to stand. This seems good. Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. So we're gonna spend a little bit of time today talking about different ways that you can have conversations with your students about AI tools and technology. Can you hear me okay on Zoom? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you very much. John, where do I point it?
Apparently the remote does not work,
Okay.
so
That's all right. That's okay.
It's the first time we tried it.
That's okay. All right, so I can just do the mouse, that'll be fine. So if you'd like to get a copy of these slides, then you can go ahead and grab them there, but because John is awesome, they'll also be in many other places as well. So if you don't want to worry about getting them right now, then don't worry about it. They will be posted later.
Maybe. We don't normally post them, but you can always ask us for a copy. But if you grab a copy of it, you'll have it, and it will ask you to, I believe, make a copy for your drive.
Okay, I'm off to a great start.
So
the recording will be available later.
Yes, and then you can always grab it from the recording. Just aim your camera at the recording and click on the link, and it should give you a copy of these in your Google Drive, which you can then edit as much as you like.
There you go. All right, so we're gonna kind of start with, and like, forgive me for this, but like I have to do this a lot of times when I walk into a classroom, which is to try not to make assumptions about anybody who's there, you know, any preconceived notions that I maybe have, thinking about like who's in the room, you know, and how they may or may not feel about things, right? So I have links to a couple of different surveys that were completed relatively recently that were all about sort of like student assumptions or students, you know, feelings about AI tools and technology. And actually, I'm going to skip ahead to the one at the very bottom because that's one that the Writing Across the Curriculum Committee from SUNY Oswego just did last fall semester. So we did do a survey on our campus as well. I was part of that process because I serve on that committee. The committee is led by Mike Murphy, who I know did a session sort of about the survey results sometime last week. Is that right, John? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he did a survey or a session about the results of that survey, but I'll just kind of highlight it really briefly. The survey that we did here went out to undergraduate students, and we got about 500-ish responses, and many of the responses were pretty varied about AI tools, but some of the responses were a little bit surprising. So not everyone is sort of like jumping on board or jumping on the bandwagon. Our students do have really varied feelings and thoughts about these tools. Some of them are like, yes, this is super cool. Some of them are like, I really like it for this, but not this. Some of our students are like, I don't want anything to do with it. And many of them really don't know how to feel, which I'll talk more about later on in this presentation. So in addition to the Writing Across the Curriculum survey that we did here, there were other surveys as well that went out that were on the screen that were talking about, you know, like mostly about how students, they don't really know how to feel, but many of them do understand or seem to communicate that using AI without saying you've used AI is dishonest to some degree. So that does seem to be a pretty big feeling among our students like at this point. So I guess like my point after all of that was try not to walk in like assuming that everyone is going to use AI to like cheat their way through a class. You know, it's not always, I don't think that's a fair thing for us to think about for our students.
Having said that, though, in surveys of high school students, somewhere between 75 and 86% of students in recent surveys have said that they have used it to help in submitting assignments without permission. So students do generally recognize that using AI without citing it is not legitimate. And in surveys in colleges, it's been somewhat mixed because other surveys have found a much higher percentage of students using it than the Oswego survey. And some of that may be because so many faculty here do say that the use of it is not appropriate. And when students know that the survey is asking them whether they're doing something which is not appropriate, that may bias their responses. So I've seen very different results in other national surveys or very large samples where I think students thought they perhaps well, while the survey was anonymous, it's not clear that the responses were necessarily accurate. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that most of your students at least have used AI in some ways before.
Oh yeah, and I totally agree with that piece, especially, I don't think the big thing that I want to try to communicate in this presentation is that we should be transparent with our students about how we feel about AI. So I think that like the days of us sort of like pretending it doesn't exist, or like, oh, if we don't say anything about it, then like they won't know about it. Like I think that happened like last year, like that's done. They know, right? Like they know that AI is a thing, and it's been integrated in so many different platforms that they know, even if they're not using generative AI tools, right? It's ingrained in social media applications. So yeah, they definitely know. So I think that it's important for us to be transparent about how we talk to them about it, which kind of goes into the next slide, or this slide rather, which is tell your students how you feel about generative AI tools and technology. Be honest with them. I think that they really appreciate that. And I also think they respond to that. It's something that I've done in my own classes for many years, try to be transparent about all sorts of different things, right? This is even like before AI. And I think like many of the good effective practices that we've established in a classroom, they still kind of carry over, right? Like being transparent with your students, explaining to them like the purpose of an assignment or what we're trying to do, and communicating with them in that way. I think that they really value that. I've had students tell me at the end of a class, like, listen, I'm glad that you told us why we're doing it this way, or why we're attempting it, like why you've staggered an assignment in this way. I think that they find that really helpful. So just be honest with them. If you're like all about AI and you're like, yeah, let's do it, then tell them why. Tell them what sorts of tools you've been experimenting with and what you've been using them for. If you're like kind of, which I mean, I'm still kind of wishy-washy in a few different ways, right? But like I tell them that, I tell them what I'm not sure about, what I'm hesitant about, what I really like and what I don't like so much. And if you're like, you know what, AI is not for me, it doesn't have a place in this particular classroom, tell them why. Tell them up front, tell them on the first day, right? Put it in your syllabus. And then that way they will know, right, what they should expect from you, or at least a little bit, right, sort of moving forward. So go ahead, John.
And also one other thing is that if you've ever searched for AI or downloaded some AI tools or visited AI while you're on social media, you will get a barrage of ads targeted at students telling them how this can be used and how it's undetectable, because many of the sites have built in better ways of protecting their output from the crappy detection things that many places still use.
That's right. And there are more, like there are different AI tools now where like, like you can have ChatGPT generate something for you, and then you can go to a different site to have it kind of like rearrange what ChatGPT does. Like Quillbot, for example, would do something like that. And those tools are all free, so they can definitely do that. So we've had workshops before that talk about statements that you can put on your syllabi. And just recently, the provost sent out a memo with some recommendations that the Committee on Academic Quality and Integrity, as well as the associate deans, had worked on. I have that linked later in this presentation if you would like another copy of it. So that went out. So that has two big examples of language that you can include in your syllabus, which I think is very, very helpful. You could also consider, like, you could have a statement or a policy, but you could consider co-creating something like that with your students. That's something that I personally have not tried yet. John, have you tried co-creating?
I have been doing that for the last few semesters.
Do you want to talk about it?
It's a good way of introducing the topic, because students in general are much more knowledgeable about AI and have used tools much more than most faculty, based on quite a few surveys that have been done. And it's probably not a bad strategy to talk about how AI tools might be used in your discipline, how practitioners are using it, because students are going to be entering a world where they will be using AI. They'll be expected to use AI, and preparing them for that is helpful. But it's also important to talk about the learning objectives for the course, what types of skills they're developing and how those are important, and that without those, just being able to enter prompts wouldn't be very helpful. But get students perhaps to buy into this, and it can be really helpful. So if you jointly develop an AI statement, it's probably going to get much more student buy-in than if it's something that appears to be imposed on them.
And that's a great suggestion. It's a good thing to think about. Like I said, I haven't done that yet. I think my own statements on AI are sort of like in between. It's like a gray area, right? I tell them, okay, like, you know, because I teach writing, it's like, okay, we'll use it for this, but I would prefer that you not use it for this, right? And one of the things that I do, because I kind of have that gray area, I don't want people to be confused. I include, like, I have a statement on my syllabus, but I also include statements on individual assignment sheets that explicitly tell my students what you can and can't do. And I want to note also that for me, I've had a decent chunk of students, I'd say probably 25% in a writing class of 20 or 25, say like, listen, Stephanie, I don't want to use AI to help me write. I'm not interested. I have feelings about it. You know, I don't like the environmental impact. I don't like that, you know, I want to be a writer someday. So I don't want, you know, whatever, I have really conflicted feelings. So I make sure that in those statements, I give the people who aren't interested the flexibility to opt out if they don't want to use it. Like John said, even like the last year, so many more of our students now are engaging with some kind of AI technology. They know a lot more about it than they did 2 years ago. So many of the students who are telling me like, listen, I'm not interested, I've played around with it, I've seen it, or my friends have used it. And then I just say like, okay, that's all right. Like, I'm not going to force you to do it if you don't want to. That's why I kind of give them the flexibility. But that's me personally. Everybody does it a little bit different.
But in many occupations, if they want to be employable,
Yes.
they have to get over that because they are moving into, well, we have to prepare students for their future and not our past, which is something that I think that some faculty perhaps would prefer to be doing. And it certainly was easier before we had AI tools. But going back to the argument about including statements in your syllabus and on assignments, it's really important to put it on assignments because students tend not to go back and look at the syllabus once the course is underway. And each instructor may have very different policies. And it's difficult for students to keep track of what is appropriate in each class, which is another reason why those discussions are helpful. So make explicit in what ways AI use may be appropriate, in which ways it may be helpful for student learning, and which ways perhaps it might impede that, and discuss that with them and make that explicit throughout the course.
And even like sort of like one more thing to piggyback off of that. In my courses, I do like different in-class activities or like very small homework assignments where we will do different things with AI so that they can, you know, like critically think or evaluate the output, things like that. Those sorts of activities are mandatory for the class, right? Like I have everybody sort of like do the activity because it has a clear purpose. For me though, like in the final written products, right? Or if they're working on their essay or something like that, this would be an example of like English 102 or composition. That's where they have the flexibility and the option. In the creative writing courses that I teach, I still give them a lot of flexibility, especially in a field like creative writing. I'm not there yet with, you know, making a stricter AI policy and saying like you have to use it in a field like creative writing. In comp, they have the flexibility. Okay, so did you have more that you wanted to say?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's also really important, even though our students are learning more about this, I've been really impressed as I talk to more students. Obviously, like a whole bunch of students come into the Office of Learning Services, you know, a whole bunch of people come into the Writing Center. So I'm having conversations with students about this all the time. They're learning a lot more, or they know a lot more about the bigger picture with AI. Like many of our students understand the environmental impacts of AI, which I think is really interesting.
One thing, though, that perhaps it's good to put that in balance is that there have been some recent studies of that. Certainly, the training took a tremendous amount of energy and water and so forth. However, streaming Netflix and streaming video takes about 98 to 100 times more use than all of the AI servers put together right now. So it's a drop in the bucket in terms of energy use. It's a fraction, a tiny fraction of 1%. Streaming video by far takes up much more. So if we're going to talk about the energy use of AI, we should probably get people to stop watching video on their devices too.
That's a good point. I didn't know about the Netflix streaming thing. I think it's interesting though, like that, you know, like 2 years ago, they weren't thinking about these sorts of things, right? Like they were just like, oh, this is a cool toy or whatever, right? But they're learning a whole lot more about it now, which I think is really interesting. Yes.
And Greg
point.
mentions Bitcoin farms, which is a completely non-productive use. At least with streaming video, people are getting some entertainment benefits. Bitcoin is just, well, it's not a very productive use of energy.
So I think it's really interesting that, like, in addition to like understanding what some of the different platforms are, they're understanding, you know, like things like ethical concerns, right? Again, I teach writing, so I talk with writers a whole lot, you know, and many of them have lots of different feelings about, you know, like the copyright issues with generative AI tools and like where the content comes from, right? Like many of them are concerned about that. Thinking like many of my students understand the bias that was talked about a whole lot when AI first kind of became a thing, but has gotten remarkably, I mean, it's still not, it's not perfect, right? But like it's made a lot of really big improvements, right? I mean, like early on, right? Like if you were using something like DALL-E and you asked DALL-E to show you a picture of a doctor, you would only get an image of like a Caucasian male in a white lab coat. And now, right, like you get much more varied imagery. So it is making really interesting, it's making really, really interesting advancements in that way.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Frank. And the same might be true about mentioning bias, because that's one of those DEI things that have been federally banned right now, as of yesterday.
So I think it's important though for our students to still really be aware and like critically evaluate what AI is doing, right? So to ask them to do these different critical thinking exercises is really, really important. So like one thing that I like to do, and you don't have to click on the link if you don't want to, but thinking about like, okay, like what's okay for an AI to do, in your opinion, right? I've used this example before, but I can't resist. I think it's so interesting. So this is a new AI, or not a new AI tool, actually, this is from a couple years ago. So an AI tool that will generate obituaries, which I think is really interesting, right? Is that okay ethically, right? If you ask a group of your students, you know, is it all right with you, right? Like, would you want your obituary to be written by an AI, or would you want a family member's obituary to be written by an AI tool, something that never knew them, right? But then like the argument could be made that, you know, writing obituaries is really hard. Like this has been something that came up in a previous workshop, you know, writing an obit is really challenging. So maybe having an AI tool do it helps, you know, like a grieving person sort of like not have to worry about that one extra piece of the process. I don't know, right? But it's a really interesting advancement, I think.
And Frank mentions, this is a little bit off to the side, but Frank mentions there that while students are expected perhaps to be able to use AI is going to have a major impact on labor markets. We don't know exactly how large that effect will be, but it's perhaps the most disruptive influence we've seen in a very long time, maybe since internal combustion engines, or maybe the printing press or something similar, that a lot of jobs are changing and a lot of jobs are disappearing. One analogy that's sometimes been used is the introduction of automated digital switching networks for the phone network, where all of a sudden telephone operators disappeared, or 95% of those jobs disappeared within 4 or 5 years. I think we're going to see a lot of that with AI as well. And it's really hard to predict the impact of that in terms of what types of jobs will be favored, what types of jobs will be lost. And that's something beyond our control. But the more we can prepare students to develop critical thinking skills and reasoning skills that will be useful in any type of job, it's going to be helpful.
Yep, I agree. I was in a talk a little while ago where, like the AI, advancements have been, sort of been compared to like the Industrial Revolution, right? And how things are changing so rapidly, like John said. Anyway, this is just one example. It's something that I've shown my students that, right? Like the empathy AI, and we've had conversations about it, just to see what they think, right? Like, is this something that you would ever want? And is this something that is okay or should be okay? I think it's worth the conversation. I will say that the Ohio State University has pulled together some really interesting and pretty good, I think, resources that John's clicking on now that really talks about this whole topic about having conversations with students. There's a whole bunch of stuff here, but I want to highlight, if you keep scrolling down, John, keep going a little bit more. Yeah. Okay. So there's a really interesting kind of set. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of other things on this webpage, which will hopefully be a helpful resource for you. But if we're thinking about like different ways that you could talk with your students about AI, there are some drop downs here that give you some suggestions or some potential starting points, which I have found really interesting and useful. So hopefully this is something that you can potentially refer to if you, think about having these conversations with your students in classes. We can go back, yeah. So I'm going to take a break from talking because this is my first day back from vacation, and I'm wondering if anybody on Zoom, like, what sorts of conversations do you have with your students about AI? Like, how do you talk to them? And what do you think that they should know?
Just unmute, or you can either put something in chat or unmute.
Yes, either is fine.
I don't,
Carlo, and I really enjoyed the ongoing conversation and certainly the support in terms of webinars like this around AI and the book studies. And my journey with AI has kind of been running parallel with how I'm supporting students. And the way I framed it is I'm kind of learning it as I'm teaching it. And that's been fun, but a unique challenge. So as I'm using it to help develop, for example, prompts for in-class discussions around the topics I teach in the School of Ed, I'm also trying to turnkey the training to students around, as future school psychologists and mental health counselors and teachers, how are they likely to use AI? So it's an incredibly, I think, energizing, fun, and at times terrifying journey because the pace is so fast.
Yes, I agree. Especially about how quickly everything changes. But I think that that's really, is that something that you share with your students also, that like you are on, like you mentioned that like you are on the journey with them? Like, is that something that you are like open with them about, or are you just kind of like experiencing as they're experiencing?
No, I've become very open with it in part because I think there should be a certain level of transparency about how I'm using it, both instructionally and pedagogically. The other is they're going to need to know how to use it in the field. So I've had some very open conversations, have built lesson plans and plan on building lesson plans in the upcoming semester. I'm teaching a class on behavioral interventions for future school psychologists. And there's going to be a whole class on using AI to generate research-based behavioral interventions, and then how to progress monitor those. So I'm really trying to lean in as much as I can and have those honest conversations.
I think that's wonderful. And I think the honest conversations are so important. And I think that's one of the ways that we can build really, like open and inclusive classrooms, right? Thinking about like how we can be transparent with each other. Thank you.
One strategy that many people are recommending is to let AI serve as a tutor or provide tutorial assistance. There was a study that was just released last week in Brazil that was done by the World Bank, where they found about a 15 to 20% learning gain for students who used AI as a tutor versus, it was a randomized controlled experiment. And it did seem to have a substantial impact on student learning.
That's one of the things that we'll actually be talking about quite a bit more in the session right after this one, is thinking about how students can use AI outside of class to help them learn. Yeah.
And SUNY is working on that. And Stephanie
Yes.
and I are both on a committee that'll be meeting beginning, I think, in a week or two, to start making plans for that.
Wonder how much of that is willingness to access it. You know, there's not the stigma or the nervousness with interacting with a real person as your tutor. It's similar to using Google. But anyways, I don't teach specifically, but I am the chair of CACI, so I can give a little feedback on what I've heard from there. And there's really three distinct tracks of thought. One is the one that Carlo's going with, which is the open use and encouragement. One is a real fear of a degradation of critical thinking skills and creativity skills, particularly coming out of some of the more creative arts-based parts of the School of Arts and Sciences. And the last one was actually an interesting reversal, because we had one faculty member that had a very, very open policy where he just required students to document their use of AI. And his feeling after doing that was that the students were being extremely lazy in their use of AI, and in using it for his class. So he actually reverted to a stricter policy. So definitely feeling out where we're at.
And AI is one of those things where there's potential benefits and some serious potential harms. And you can use AI to help develop critical thinking skills, or it could be used as a substitute for those by students. There was a study that just came out about a month ago in Switzerland that found that it did lead to offloading some cognitive skills to AI tools. And actually, there'll be a podcast on that in about 3 or 4 weeks. And similarly, in any case, there are concerns on either side. It can be very helpful for students. It's also extremely helpful for students who have some disabilities, who have some barriers to learning. It can support neurodiverse learners in ways that work much more efficiently than other types of approaches. So, but it can also, again, serve as a shortcut to learning, which is not what we want to do. And it's going to be up to us in terms of how we structure our courses so that students do continue to develop critical thinking skills.
Yes, definitely. I do think that there were 1 or 2 comments in the chat, John.
Oh, okay.
I just want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody.
Yeah, students want transparency.
Okay.
They talked about that last week in a session. And yes, storing things in cloud has power and water implications. And so forth. But yes.
Earlier. Okay, excellent. I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Okay.
No, thank you.
No, that's all right. So, all right. So if we're thinking about, ways that we can encourage this transparency, right, between us and our students, depending on what you're, and again, like John was just saying, it all depends on how you structure your course, right? You have the autonomy to decide what you want to do with AI, how you want to do it, right? How frequently, on what assignments, all of those sorts of things. So depending on how you structure your course, that's what's going to kind of lead into this next little bit, right? So, but like if you are at a course like one of mine where like using AI on some things is okay, but on other things is not okay, it's still really, and I mean, I do this anyway in a class like composition because, you know, English 102 is one of those courses that is supposed to teach about academic integrity and what that means, right? You know, obviously there's plagiarism, but there are the other ways that you can violate academic integrity as well. Many of which my students don't know about, right? They all know that plagiarism is bad, but they don't know, right? Like the other ways that you can violate academic integrity here on our campus. So I always make a point to go over that with them, show them the page, which is linked here for you, you know, and really talk about, okay, this is what this means. This is what, you know, could happen. You know, here are potential penalties. Here's what you might have to do. And all of that conversation tends to be really eye-opening for many of my students. So I encourage you, you know, like you don't need to spend a whole day going over the thing, but help them understand that, you know, like, yes, this is on our syllabi, but many of them don't go to the web page, right? They don't look at it. So help them understand that if they do use AI on work that they're not supposed to, there can be really serious consequences, right? So again, that transparency there I think is very important. And then I mentioned earlier today that I had linked the recommendations from the Committee on Academic Equality and Integrity, as well as from the associate deans that the provost sent out earlier. So that is the hyperlinked recommendations right there. So you can link, or you can find that there as well in as in the other places. Okay, so depending on how you feel about all of these sorts of things, you want to kind of emphasize that sort of throughout the semester. So for me, because I teach writing courses, you know, we really value originality and voice and the ability to critically think. Those are important skills, right? And anyone who wants to do anything with writing, right, beyond graduation needs to be able to do those things. And there are other things also, right? But I tried to pick sort of like the big ones. AI can do those things, right? Like AI can be original. AI has a voice if you tell it to have a voice, right? AI can do really interesting critical thinking sorts of things, right? Like it can do those things. But for me and for my students, I'm arguing with them that like you need to be able to do this to at least some extent, because if you can't do it by yourself, how are you going to understand how to interact with an AI tool to effectively use it right after you graduate from college? So you need to have some kind of, there needs to be some kind of base level or base knowledge, right? Could you eventually, if you spend enough time with ChatGPT and watch enough tutorials or like ask it enough things, could you figure out how to like master it, for lack of a better word? Yeah, you could, right? But you need to have that baseline. That's super important. And again, for my students who are not interested in using or engaging with AI tools, you know, then they have to be exceptionally strong, right? Because they need to be able to do the things that an AI tool can also do, right? Faster. But they need to have that. You need to have those abilities. So I try to really emphasize the importance of that. And that's one of the reasons why in my courses, when I'm scaffolding assignments and I'm asking my students to evaluate different things, which is a huge part in writing courses, right? Evaluate this. Tell me how good this is, or how real this is, or how biased this is. That skill is really, really important. So I make sure to tell my students, like, this is why we're doing this, because it connects to our ultimate goal, right? By the end of the semester, I want you to be able to do this. I like to help my students think about AI for brainstorming, which is one of my favorite ways to use it. And it's one of the things that I've talked about a lot in these workshops and in other places, you know, using AI for brainstorming and how it can be helpful. There is, I mean, I do still think as a writing teacher that there is a real value in sitting down in front of a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen and struggling through an idea or thoughts, right? Is that kind of an old school way to think about it? I think a little bit, right? Will that strategy work for everyone? No, absolutely not, right? And that's one of the reasons why I've started integrating AI and brainstorming more into my courses, because it helps those students who, like, honestly just don't know where to start, a little bit, right? And I think that that's really important. Like, I value the struggle and kind of like figuring out where things go. But I also really recognize that some of my students are going to be so incredibly frustrated that they can't even get started because they want to give up before they can even begin. And I think that AI can be a really, really helpful tool for them in that respect, which is why I've started integrating it so much for brainstorming and kind of getting started in that way. John?
And some of my writer friends have commented a bit on these topics, and they use it. They've been using AI pretty much since it was available, not so much to develop plot ideas or to develop the basic story that they're working on or the book they're working on or the novel, but they often use it to look for possible settings for a scene or a description of a scene or something similar. And they're using it to be more efficient in their writing, so they can focus on the main narrative without getting bogged down and looking up details, because they can get those details from AI, and they just get a large number of scenarios and they mix and match them together in a way that fits into their creative process. So it can speed up that process at any stage, not necessarily just at the beginning, but also when you're trying to put your characters into a specific location. It can help you do that more efficiently.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things that I really like to do later in the process, right, is, like upload a proposal or an outline or whatever, right, into ChatGPT and ask it to find like either holes in what I'm saying, or ask it to find different perspectives that could be challenged, and like what might someone say, like what might someone think about like this particular thing, what might be wrong with this, or what might people have feedback on about this that might be negative. And I think that that's really helpful, because it helps me, you're in your own head when you're doing a thing, right? And you try to think about all the outside perspectives, but you can't always, right? So I think having something tell me, oh, have you considered this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Has been immensely helpful without having to talk to like 30 different people, And
a number of faculty have developed chat bots that serve that purpose, that are contrarian chat bots. So students will submit an argument and it will provide counter arguments or critique their arguments and so forth, which is a good way of getting some feedback and helping to improve their critical thinking skills by seeing gaps in some of their reasoning or analysis.
Exactly. So I'm wondering, from everyone who's here, or someone who's here, what's a way that you sort of like promote purpose or like try to help your students be engaged in your classes? So we could tie it to AI, or just kind of like, how do you help your students understand like the purpose of what they're learning, or what's important in what they're learning in your classes?
Feel free to open your mic.
I'll just comment real quick. I have not really used AI much in that regard. I probably should. That's one reason why I'm here. But I'm very traditional in the sense I ask them sometimes to write what they feel is the main points of a particular reading we're trying to discuss, and then I will read it if they don't, it's anonymous or something. I can read it if they're reluctant to publicly say what they believe, the points are. But I still, and it's because I'm a historian, I still like to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, getting student reflections is a really good strategy on having students say, why is it important to be learning this? Why might this be useful? Because they're more likely to buy into learning and putting in the effort if they see that it's important for something they want to do in the future.
Would you have either of you ever used AI real time in conversation in a class?
Yes.
Yeah, I have too.
Several times.
And you show it on the screen and that kind of thing?
Yep. Sometimes it can be sort of I think it's sort of like a twofold thing, right? It can be really wonderful but it can also, like, you can't guarantee doing it in real time that you're going to get the kind of result that you like really want, right? So if you're feeling cautious about that, then you can always like have the conversation beforehand and then like do a screenshot or something to kind of show one thing. I've done that like when AI like makes mistakes or makes errors or you know, says something wrong. I'll save it so that I can show my students sort of later. But there's something wonderfully thrilling about doing it in real time. And a lot of the times, like my students get like super involved in the process. So like I was doing a presentation a little while ago and I had a student who was super into playing D&D. And he had mentioned, he's like, yeah, I've tried to use ChatGPT to like help me come up with stories for Dungeons and Dragons, but when I tried it, it just like the story was horrible. I really didn't like it. So the class had been kind of about prompt engineering and like prompting and like thinking about what strategies you can use to get a more desirable output. So like we pulled up ChatGPT in class and like, you know, I said, okay, like let's see if we can come up with a D&D scenario here that is more to your liking. And we ended up doing it like it was a class activity. A bunch of people were getting involved. They were making suggestions, whatever. And it was a really fun thing. But again, it's like you can't guarantee an output. So sometimes it can be harder to have like a set goal at the end, but sometimes I think the experimentation is the lesson. Like that can be the goal. How about you, John?
And if it's something different than you expect, that can actually be a good learning experience to
Yeah.
talk to students about how they may get results that differ from their expectations. Well, what I've generally seen is that you don't get as many errors or as many mistakes as you used to.
Not
The
anymore,
quality
yeah.
of the output is dramatically better than it was a year or two ago. So, but it can often be interesting and will often bring up points that you might not have addressed otherwise. So I think it's a good strategy. I've only done it a few times in my capstone course, but it can be helpful and students really enjoy it.
I think the other thing that I found myself doing is stealing a lot of lines from people who do training that emphasize kind of the placement for AI. And the two that I think a lot about, and one may have been from our book study, John, but you know, AI is a great place to start, but not a great place to finish. I think that's really important, especially when it comes to generating ideas. You don't want it to be your finished product, but it's a good place to start. The other, a little more optimistic, is AI will get you to third base, but it takes a human to get you home. And I really agree with both of those sentiments and try to communicate that to students as well.
I agree, which is one of the reasons why I try to tell my students, like, listen, you need to be wherever your base is in your discipline or in your personal preference, right? Listen, like students, like you need to at least be here in order for this relationship to work, right? So I think that that's really important. I mean, I feel similarly in that, Frank. Ramin?
Thanks, everybody. I think part of our education of our students has to also involve intellectual property and its relationship with the use of AI. I mean, you can't just talk about the tool without talking about the fact that everything you put into it could potentially become part of its data set unless you have an enterprise version of IBM's C3 thing, or ChatGPT has an enterprise version that actually seals out the possibility of your content getting out. It is a breach of confidentiality if you actually post information to ChatGPT that are secrets of your company, enterprise. I mean, so we do have to talk about that. Obviously there is a generating new ideas, and playing, as is being explained, is fantastic. And people have had significant gains in using the tool as far as real production situations are concerned, not education necessarily. So it is imperative for our students to learn about it. But there is an interplay here between IP and AI use. And I think we got to figure out how to talk about that with our students too.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Ramin. I think that's super important. And that's one of the things that, like, when I was speaking earlier about how our students are understanding more about AI, like they're understanding more about like we talked about the environment, we talked about some of the bias stuff, some of the ethics in regard to, you know, like the copyright problems, right? But I have found so far that many of my students don't understand the data privacy piece as much as the other pieces. And that's huge, right? And I think it's so important for them to understand how it works, right? And that, you know, like there was one thing that I read about a little while ago that I thought was really apt, which is like the free version of a lot of these AI tools are free because like you're training you're training them, so like they're getting paid like with your data, right? And I think that's true. So I think it's really important for our students to understand that, like, listen, you shouldn't input some stuff, and like to John's point, for later, right? Like when you graduate, you need to understand, right, that like some information can't be inputted, right, because it would violate privacy considerations. So I think that's really important.
And for faculty, it's really important
Yes.
that we don't upload student personal information.
Yeah.
I know increasingly faculty are using this to get feedback on students' work or to generate feedback. I have mixed feelings about that. I have never done that, but if you do that, make sure you remove any personally identifying information when you do so. And also tell students that if they're going to be submitting their work, make sure they don't put in information about their home address, their phone number, maybe their name and other information, because otherwise it could become part of the training database. If they play around with one of the obituaries, someone might find that they're dead when they use an AI tool at some point later. So it is important that students are aware of that.
Thank you for bringing that up, Ramin.
And Frank noted that his engineer major son says that AI is excellent at programming and it's gotten a lot better, which can have significant implications for Ramin's discipline.
Computer science, yeah. All right, I think I know we're getting to the end of the time, so I'll kind of go through this quickly, but not too quickly. So let's say that, like, you know, like you did all of the things, right? Like you did everything right. You talked to your students, you were transparent, you were open and honest, you shared your feelings, right? You felt as though like you really understood each other, and yet you think that somebody is using an AI tool the wrong way anyway, right? Or the way that you're not looking for them to use it. So there are a few different things. I think the first two are really good suggestions. I've done them both many times, and I think they're usually it's usually a really interesting conversation. So like this first example was a professor who usually reaches out and asks to speak with the student. I prefer to do it in person because I teach in person, so that works best for me. But usually just ask and say like, hey, can you come in? You know, like I'd like to just sit down. I have some questions for you. I try to leave it relatively open, right? I don't say like, I want to talk to you about this paragraph in your paper. So I just say like, hey, I have some questions about, you know, like the work that you submitted. Can you come in and we'll have a conversation? I just leave it like that. They come in, and then usually in that meeting, I will ask them the second citation here, which talks about, listen, can you explain, you know, like this one part in your paper? I wasn't sure, you know. I also, you know, can you summarize this section here? Can you talk to me about what you were thinking at this point? Sometimes, like, I will point out to them, like, if there's like a huge like shift in tone from like one part to the next, like I'll point it out and I'll say like, hey, this sounds really different to me. And I'll give them examples. I'll say like, here, you know, like you use these sorts of words, and then here you were using these words. Can you tell me why? In most of the time when I have those conversations, they kind of like fess up. Not always.
I've only had one student who didn't confess when I've talked to them about these topics.
I've had probably 3. I'm not very scary though. So, I mean, it could be that. But like most of them will say like, yeah, like Stephanie, like I used AI, like whatever. And then that gives us an opportunity to revisit the academic integrity policy, to talk about their next steps, to talk about what they're going to do, you know, and then sort of like go on from there. But most of them have been very forthcoming. It's a lot of extra though, right? Like it's more time to take out with those sorts of things. So I do recognize that it's not a quick thing. It's not a quick fix.
And it's most likely to happen when students have high stakes graded assessments where they run out of time, where they decide to take a shortcut. You know, if you scaffold your assignments and you do them in small chunks, it's a little bit less likely. If you do more group work or work with peers, it's also a little bit less likely, although it still shows up there occasionally too.
Yep. Most of the students, when I have conversations, will say, I ran out of time. I got desperate. I didn't want a 0. So I did this because I didn't manage my time well. Is there anything else? Do I have another slide?
Well, this at the bottom, we should mention, it's a great activity where if you'd like to describe it.
Yeah. So one thing that you can do, and I've done this in many of my classes, which is kind of fun, is give your students like, you can it can be digital or it can be a handout. I usually give them like excerpts from like 3 different short passages. So we'll say like 3 paragraphs, right? And I will ask them to identify which one they think has been written by AI. And most of them, probably 80 to 90% of the class, can identify the AI written excerpt compared to the 2 excerpts that are written by humans. And I make a point then to tell them, if you can do it, right, and it's clear to you that this was written by AI and these 2 were not, what makes you think that I can't figure it out as well, right? So like, again, trying to be very transparent and very honest with them and say like, listen, there is a difference. Like, let's look and now let's talk about what makes this different from the other 2. So it's a really interesting activity that I'd encourage you to try, if you have some time.
And those differences, though, are getting smaller and smaller. And depending how sophisticated the student is with generating prompts, it becomes harder and harder to do that. But right now, that still works with a lot of simple prompts given to an AI tool.
And I think it helps make a point also, right? That like, there are still differences, so yeah. So these are just some clues to look for. So look for inconsistencies in a writing style. That's easier to do.
Carla, the link was at the very beginning. We can go back there right at the end, so you can grab it.
So I'll go quick. So inconsistencies in writing styles are way easier to find if you assign scaffolded writing or scaffolded assignments, which is something that I really like to do. It also gives me something to point back to, so I can say like, hey, in this one, you sounded like this, and now like 2 weeks later, you sound like this. Can you tell me why? If there are inaccuracies or content that is not true, which is still a thing, but less of a thing than it was before, AI still loves lists. So unless you specify to not do a list, but like if you don't, then usually the go-to is a list. So if you see lots of lists, then there's that. Content that is very, very general, because our students are getting better at prompt engineering, but they're still not awesome at it. And if like the formatting or the just like good old school like plagiarism, right? If the font suddenly changes, right, or the color of the font changes or whatever, then that's something that you can look for. So John's gonna, I think, go back to the.
Yes, go back to the slides. So if anyone would like a copy of the slides, which has all these links, you can just aim your camera at this and then choose to download it to Google Drive, and then you'll have your own copy, which you can add to or delete, whatever you'd like to do with it.
And if anybody would like to have, I'm over time, so I'm going to wrap up. But if anybody would like to have any follow-up conversations, I'm more than happy to do so. So please don't hesitate to send me an email.
Me too.
And John. John gets a lot of email, but John too. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. And our next session is on AI again. So we've got a lot of AI sessions this week because Stephanie's no longer in the Caribbean.
No longer in the Caribbean. I'm back in the freezing cold as we go weather.